Right. Welcome to another session of Client Operating Systems. Hope you're all well. Where our main focus is going to be on the upcoming assignment, specifically the storage spaces, as well as the BitLocker question, as far as that particular document or assessment is concerned. Now, just remember that when it comes to submission, your Blackboard platform is your default go-to as far as your particular assessments are concerned. And please ensure that you stick to the actual due dates and times, just to avoid, obviously, loss of marks as far as your particular assessment there is concerned. And also take distinct cognizance of especially the cutoff times. Try and avoid submitting 5 minutes before the actual time arises. Ensure that you obviously plan ahead accordingly, and then you submit well ahead of time, just to avoid any particular glitches or any particular discrepancies that might arise as far as the actual platform or your system or network connectivity at large there is concerned. Now, naturally, when it comes to the actual systems that we're using, there's an option, obviously, between HyperV, which is your type 1 hypervisor, and VirtualBox, which is your type 2 hypervisor. I think we've already had discussions and obviously lectures on end in detail that literally elucidate on what is happening as far as the VirtualBox environment is concerned. I think what we distinctively have not undertaken, especially from a recording platform, is your Hyper-V type of scenario. Now, we've looked at this in our face-to-face sessions, right? So I think almost every one of us should be familiar as far as that particular environment is concerned. But ultimately, I think in this particular session as well, I'm just going to quickly go through setting up your virtual machine in your Hyper-V environment before we delve on to the actual questions that distinctively need some kind of revisit and understanding in order for us to successfully complete the assessment at large. Now, with Hyper-V, remember we've mentioned before that in order for you to take full advantage of that particular platform, it's imperative for you to be running the right version of your Windows 10 installation, which is distinctively your Pro, your Enterprise, as well as Education. As far as configurations would go, you'd obviously need to turn these particular features on within your environment. And at the same time, it's also necessary just to ensure proper functionality, that you've got virtualization also enabled within the BIOS as far as firmware space, as far as your particular machine there is concerned. So if you look at it from a basic setting point of view here, if you go to your control panel, so here we're going to quickly dash off to your control panel. And then within the control panel, you'll find that there's an option to access your programs and distinctive features. You'll select that option. And then from there, on your left-hand side navigation pane there, you'll find turn Windows features on or off. So once you select that particular option, you'll find the different features associated with your Windows install. Hyper-V is what we want to literally concentrate on. So what you will need to do is just to expand everything within your Hyper-V environment there, and then ensure that everything is checked or literally selected. So your Hyper-V management tools, within that platform, you've got your GUI management tools, and then you also have the Hyper-V module for your Windows PowerShell. Then you also have the Hyper-V platform, which would encompass your Hyper-V hypervisor, as well as your distinctive services in that regard. So just ensure that everything is selected and nothing is grayed out. And once you've selected that and you click on OK, obviously the system would ask for a restart, accept that restart. And once your particular machine successfully restarts, naturally your Hyper-V environment should be distinctively activated or turned on as far as your system would go. The other thing, like I mentioned a couple of moments back, is that you might also want to ensure that you confirm virtualization being enabled in your firmware, your BIOS setups, especially if you find that there are certain sections within your HyperV features there that are distinctively grayed out as far as functionality there is concerned. So once that is done, what you then want to do is on your search bar again, if you type out Hyper there, you'll find that your HyperV manager is part of the results that are displayed in that regard. You'll select that. And once you've selected your HyperV manager there, you'll find that your the desktop or the actual machine that you're running there is listed. And on your right-hand side here, you'll find the Actions navigation pane that literally enables you to create new virtual machines, manage already existing ones, and look at functioning already existing virtual machines as far as your environment would go. So what you want to concentrate on specifically there is the new option. Once you select it, you'll have the virtual machine, hard disk, and floppy disk that is displayed on the context or the options menu that is there. Select your virtual machine option. And then from there, there's a wizard that just enables you to literally create your virtual machine to your distinctive spec as far as configurations are concerned. So you'll next that. You'll obviously need to name your machines in accordance to what they've asked of as far as your assessment would go. Now, remember, I've mentioned before that if you're using on-premises machines within the actual labs and computer rooms, these machines are obviously accessed by a lot of other individuals or students. What you want to then do is to ensure that the virtual machine is distinctively tied to your either profile or name, if you look at it from a different perspective. So they've mentioned GRC-PC01 there. What you then want to also do is to ensure that you incorporate your name in front of the actual initial label and possibly the first letter of your surname in that regard. And then once you've done that, you'll next it. We're not going to go through generation 1 and 2 again. We've discussed these in detail before. You'll next that. And then I think from a RAM point of view, we've also mentioned that in order for your machines to be smooth, so obviously both your host as well as your guests, which are the virtual machines, you need to obviously allocate the hardware resources accordingly across the different platforms there in order for you to look at a smooth function as far as your machines would go. So you'd obviously want to work with a scenario or a system that is sitting with at least 8 gigs of RAM. We've discussed this before. It doesn't mean that a 4 gig machine will not function. It just ensures alleviation of issues that might literally arise, which is literally either machines crashing or them not responding in the entirety because you don't have enough hardware resources to accommodate for that virtualization platform or virtualized platform in that particular instance. So you want to go with 2048 as far as your particular RAM allocation, which is obviously equivalent to 2 gigs for both machines. You will next that. And then as far as the actual switches would go, remember you've got your default and the student internal that you need to create. For the first machine, you've got default. Once you've selected the default switch there, you'll next it. And then obviously you need to specify the actual size or capacity of the VHD that you'll create for this machine. So normally by default, you've got the 127 gig incorporated there. You can change it down to the 50 that we've literally indicated in our face-to-face sessions before. Leave it as is, whichever way. And then you can also dictate where this particular VHD would sit. So sometimes when you look at creation of your particular machines, the moment you click on finish, you get certain errors where that particular disk cannot be allocated accordingly in that regard. You just need to then specify or change location as far as your environments would go. So how you'd obviously do that, if you click on browse here, for instance, if you want to set something up, let's say on our desktop, just for argument's sake, we can then select that as our distinctive folder, possibly maybe create a new one to ensure the appropriate access of content and storage of it. So here I can just mention, let's put this as our CNOS assignment, VHDs. right? And then within that, we can incorporate our VHD. And then we next that. Obviously going to install an operating system later. We'll next that. And then there's a summary in terms of the actual name, generation, memory, all the way down to the actual operating system setup there. We'll finish that. And then if everything is undertaken accordingly, then your actual virtual machine is distinctively created. And then you've got that incorporated in that particular instance. Now, remember what you've just done, like we've discussed before in previous sessions, and as well as for VirtualBox, is that you've got a shell of a machine where you just you're sitting literally with your generic resources, which is your CPU, your RAM, and your hard drive, which is literally mimicked by the VHD that you've just created. You'll now need to specify the actual operating system as far as installation would go. So if you right click on the actual machine itself, you've got connect all the way down to help. You're going to select the connect option. And then from there, what you want to then do is specify where your operating system is going to be loading from. So you will access the or literally click on the media option as far as your menu bar there is concerned. Select that, and what you want to concentrate on is the DVD drive. Remember, we've got those three ways of installation, which is your DVD boot, your image installation, and then your distribution share. So in this particular instance, you're going to go and select insert disk. And then from there, you specify where your actual OS or where the actual ISO is. So mine is on the desktop here, specifically within software. So what I'm going to select is the Windows 10. Remember, your Windows installation should be at least Pro. So Pro Enterprise or Education is a ISO that you, or literally the version of Windows that you're supposed to be installing in accordance to this particular assessment. So you'll select your ISO, click and select open or double click on it, whichever way, and then you should have that particular ISO now listed in that regard. What you'll then need to do there is just select start, and also automatically the installation takes place. So this is an actual attended installation. So you'll now need to then specify where the installation is going to be, which particular version you're going to be installing, and also look at reading the end user license agreements and so on as part and parcel of the actual installation at large in that regard. So that's what you want to look at as far as your creation would go. And then obviously, when it comes to your switches, you've got the virtual switch manager. In this particular instance, you'll select that, and then you can always create new external, internal, or private switches in accordance to your virtual environment as far as your particular setup would go. So like I mentioned before, you've got the default switch for the first machine. And then for the second machine, you'll need to set up a student internal switch in that regard. So that's the basics for anyone who might have missed that session as far as creation of your virtual machines there is concerned. Like I mentioned before, the main focus as far as today's session is concerned is to look at the whole concept of your storage spaces, as well as BitLocker. I think we had a couple of questions in that regard as far as functionality is concerned. So if you look at your actual document, we remember storage space is part and parcel of RAID, right? Or literally within the same confines as far as RAID is concerned, because both of those architectures are looking at fault tolerant configurations, trying to just safeguard against foreseeable disasters or issues when it comes to data storage, right? So your storage spaces is your literal Microsoft or Windows offering that literally mimics or works within the same confines as far as redundant array of independent or inexpensive disks architecture is concerned. Arguably, you've got a couple of schools of thought that will mention that storage spaces is a bit more advanced as compared to your generic RAID configurations in that regard. So you obviously need to have multiple disks that are available for configuration in this regard, because remember, the way in which this fault-tolerant architecture functions is to at least have similar copies of content or files, you name it, across different disks, so that if one particular disk malfunctions, then ultimately you can salvage your content or data from the other disks that are in your environment in that regard. So on the first machine, they've asked you to create a 20 gig two-way mirror. And then on the second machine, a 20 gig parity storage. So again, I'm not going to go into detail in terms of what a two-way mirror or parity storage is concerned. Why? Because we've discussed this in detail in previous sessions before. Go back to that recorded content if you're not familiar, or if you still need a revisit as far as that particular content is concerned. So in this particular instance, what we will need to do is to create our VHDs within our environment. Once we've created those, then we literally can start working with our storage spaces platforms in this particular instance. And remember, to access storage spaces, you also need to access your control panel because it's one of the options in that particular environment. So the first thing that you want to literally do now is that within your, so this is obviously going to be working within your virtual environment, right? So once you've clicked on File Explorer and you've accessed your this PC icon, you'll right-click on it, and then from the options menu or context menu that appears, you want to then select Manage. And then from your computer management console, you want to then select or work with the disk management platform. So what we want to do here is ensure that that is enlarged. So what you want to then do is that you want to work with disk management. And remember, disk management just enables you to look at connected drives, the actual partitions, free space, you name it, in that particular instance. So here we want to create our virtual disks. These are the ones that we'll use as far as our storage spaces they are concerned. So you're going to go and select action. So obviously, what you want to ensure is that everything works accordingly as far as your actual redundant configuration or your fault tolerant architecture there is concerned. So you're going to select action, and then from the options that appear, you're going to then select create VHD, and then you're literally going to then select browse this. So I think what we can do is within our CNOS VHDs again, we can then create another a folder there just for argument's sake. And name it storage spaces VHDs. And then obviously within that, we can have we can just, for argument's sake, mention first year. You can always change it accordingly. So we've got our first VHD. I'm going to save that. And then remember, we want to put it as 20 gigs. We can make it dynamically expanding. You can also choose between VHD and VHDX. The only difference there is that one has been made for more recent architecture, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. VHD literally works with legacy configurations in that regard as far as your particular setups is concerned. Again, content that we've discussed before. And then we okay that. And our first VHD is created. We go back again, create another one, browse again within our same environments. So I'm going to call this one second. And then literally save it. Again, this is 20 gigs. I'm going to okay that. Dynamically expanding. Okay, that we've got our second one there. Put in another one. Create VHD. We're going to call this one our third. So this is third. Save it again. Gig storage. This is going to be our 20 gigs. Dynamically expanding. Okay, and just for the fun of it, we're going to go with the fourth one. So create. I'm going to browse that. We're going to go with the fourth, right? Save that again, gigs, that 20. Dynamically expanding, and then we click on OK. So now we've got our 4 VHDs created. But as you can see, our initial one, the one that's for the host, just for argument's sake, is listed as online. The ones that we've just created here are not initialized. So obviously we need to initialize them first. And then after initialization, we then need to format in order for us to prepare these particular platforms for storage. Remember, when you're formatting, you're actually incorporating a file system. Part and parcel of that is ensuring that your storage platform is available for usage, if you want to look at it from a different perspective. So the first thing that you want to do is right-click where it has the actual disk label there. Once you've right-clicked on that, you've got initialize disk all the way down to help. What you want to concentrate on there is initialize the actual disk itself, and then it will automatically identify the disks that are not initialized. And then obviously when it comes to partitioning style, you've got MBR versus GPT. Again, we've gone through the motions in that regard. I'm going to leave it as MBR in this regard. Click on OK. And then once that is done, all our disks now, the ones that we've just created, are all online, as you can see. But the space still remains unallocated because we literally need to ensure that we format these accordingly to literally prepare for storage. So you're going to right-click on the unallocated space there, select New Simple Volume from the options that appears, next it, because we're using the entirety of the actual disk space, automatic allocation of an actual drive letter. You next that, and then when it comes to volume label, just for argument's sake, we're going to put that as just generically data. We'll enable file and folder compression. Next it, there's a bit of a summary as usual. Finish it, and then once that is done, naturally that particular disk is opened up or literally available for use. You'll do the same for the second one. Next that. We're also going to put this as just distinctively data, enable, next, finish. And then again, same difference would apply for the third and the fourth. So we're going to right click, new volume, next, automatic allocation of a drive letter there. Again, we're going to specify this as data, enable file and folder compression, next it, finish. And then lastly, we've got our last or fourth drive there. We're going to put our data there, enable, next, finish. Right, so now we've got our four disks incorporated in that regard. So what you want to do then, obviously, if you go to your this PC setup, you'll find now that we've got your data, D, there, E, F, and G incorporated. So now we want to create the storage spaces or the storage pool that will obviously enable us to look at a fault-tolerant architecture environment in this regard. So what you then want to do, I think we can also close this up. What you then want to do is if you go back to your control panel again, you want to access your storage spaces. So I think if you go back to the assessment here, we've got a two-way mirror on the first machine, like we mentioned a couple of moments ago, and a parity storage on the second machine. So the drive letters will all be E, and the actual storage space name is going to be user data. So that's fine. So once you've gone into your control panel, you'll find your storage spaces, click on it. And then from there, you should be able to then create a new pool or distinctive storage space in this regard. So you then select where it says create a new pool and storage space. Once you've selected that, you should then get the different options in terms of the actual disk that you're using in this particular instance. So for argument's sake, I'm going to go with D and F there, disk 1 and 3. Whichever option works in that regard is still fine. So once we've selected that, what you then want to do is look at selecting create pool, right? So we click on create pool. It prepares your drives. And then in this particular instance now, remember, we've mentioned that it's user data as far as the actual storage space there is concerned. So it's going to be user data. And then as far as the drive letter is concerned, they've mentioned E here, But I'm sure, as obviously in this particular instance, because we've got E incorporated there, just for argument's sake, I'm going to put it as H, just for illustration purposes, because I think E is already used in that regard, but same difference still applies in your particular instance. The resiliency type is where you obviously need to specify. So the first one is obviously the two-way mirror. Remember, you've got simple, no resiliency. You've got your three-way mirror. You've got the actual parity in that regard. So parity would be for the second machine. Here, we're going to leave it as a two-way mirror. And remember, as far as your allocation, as far as your configuration there is concerned, we want to then have that as your 20 gig as far as configurations would go in that regard. Once all that information pans out and literally is similar to what is incorporated in your assessment, you'll then select create storage space. So you obviously need to take a screenshot of that beforehand to ensure everything is displayed accordingly in that regard, or literally take a screenshot of the final product, because it will show you the actual user data, a name, the actual drive letter, it being a two-way mirror, and obviously it being of 20 gig space in that particular instance. And then you screenshot that, and then you're good to go as far as your storage space platform would go. And then ultimately, if you want to access that, obviously using your, so here we can just quickly minimize this. If you go to your file explorer and you go to this PC, you should find that you now have that user data incorporated there, which is part and parcel of your storage space environment, which is literally combined drives D and F into one distinctive platform as far as your configurations there is concerned. So that's your storage space platform. And then with the BitLocker question, what you're looking at, I think we can also close this up. So this you can literally screenshot and close up. And then what you've got as far as actual, okay, so let's close that up. There you go. So what you've got with the actual BitLocker question, what have we got here? This one here, configuring BitLocker for non-OS volumes. So remember, when it's non-OS, it just means that it's a volume that is not actually having that doesn't have an operating system incorporated in that regard. So the generic volumes that are used for storage in that instance. So if you want to look at what I mean in that instance here, if you click on this PC icon again, you find the local disk in this particular instance, which is your drive C, has got a Windows logo there. So that is a typical example of a drive that is an OS volume, which obviously has your operating system installed in that regard. So the volumes we can play around with here would obviously be data E and G in this particular instance, because there's no operating system that is loaded as far as those particular volumes they are concerned. So configuring BitLocker on any one of the non-OS volumes. So again, you're going back to your control panel here. So once your control panel is opened up, what you want to then obviously work with is your BitLocker drive encryption, right? So once you click on that, you should be able to then look at incorporating BitLocker for the configurations that are there. So in this particular instance, I think we've already mentioned what BitLocker is all about, what encryption is. Remember, just scrambling data into a non-readable form in order for you to enhance security as far as your stored data there is concerned. So ultimately, what you're looking at in this particular instance is naturally the need for keys, which will obviously be used to scramble the data, right, which is encrypting, and then also descrambling the data, which is decrypting, or the decryption process. So naturally, you normally will have asymmetric environments where you've got a public key that is used for encryption, and then you've got a private key that is used for decryption. So it's asymmetric because you're using two different keys for the processes in that particular instance. We've already mentioned and talked about symmetric environments where you're using similar keys for both the encryption and the decryption process in this regard. So you've got your Windows inbuilt encryption mechanism that just tries to look at a better way of safeguarding stored data. so that if your drives become compromised in any particular instance, content cannot be accessed in that particular setup. Why? Because it's scrambled or literally encrypted, not readily identifiable by the naked eye if you look at it from a different point of view, obviously without the appropriate decryption or descrambling key in that regard. So let's assume that we want to work with E there as far as our particular setup is concerned. We'll expand that particular option, and then we can literally select turn on BitLocker. So we'll click on turn on BitLocker. And then in this particular instance now, we obviously need to incorporate a password for unlocking the actual drive itself. So you click on that, and then you specify whichever password that you want to go with. Just ensure that it's a strong password, obviously something that you will remember as well. So I will incorporate my password here, and then retype in the password. Right. Once that is done, I don't want to use a smart card to unlock the actual drive itself. But obviously, if the option is there, or if you've got the mechanisms put in place, it's also something that you might want to consider. You'll next that. And then once you've next that, remember the actual recovery key needs to be placed somewhere else, right? To ensure that you can run it accordingly. So you've got save to an Azure Active Directory account, save onto a USB flash drive, save to a file, or literally print the key. So remember, it's important for you to make sure that you select the right option for your right setup, or that is literally right for your environmental setup in that regard, right? So normally saving into account can be a bit advantageous because accessible from anywhere. But sometimes when it comes to your configuration and you don't have that, you might want to then consider a flash drive. But if that flash drive gets lost now and you can't access your content, and you obviously need to decrypt accordingly, that could be a bit problematic rather in that instance. So ultimately, it's important for you to make sure that you select something that is applicable to your environment as far as setups would go. Obviously, same difference with printing the actual key itself. If that is also jeopardized, then naturally the whole idea and exercise of having encrypted in the first place becomes null and void. So I'm going to select save to an Azure AD account. Once I've done that, it'll literally save my key there, and then ultimately it will show your recovery key has been saved. You'll next that. And then ultimately, you've got different options of encrypting either the actual use space itself or encrypting the entirety of the drive. I'm going to select it, or I'm going to leave it as the default in terms of selection. And remember, you can always go through that content to look at understanding specifically the differences in that regard as far as your encryption process would go. Next, that. And then ultimately also ensuring new encryption modes or compatible mode configurations that is there. There's a description again in terms of what's happening in that regard. Do yourselves a solid and look through that content to get an understanding as well in terms of what that distinctively means. So you've got best for fixed drives on the actual device itself. So this would be our option in this regard. But when it comes to compatible mode, best for drives that can be moved from the actual device. So normally you want to work with, especially when you're dealing with your external drives. And so although you've got BitLocker to go, which is a more appropriate option or architecture for any removable drives in that regard. So this would be applicable for us. Instance, so we'll next that, and then you get your basic summary there. Are you ready to encrypt the actual drive? And then you'll be able to unlock using an actual password. Encryption might take a while depending on the size of the drive. Naturally, until encryption is complete, your files rather won't be protected. Then you want to select start encrypting, and then obviously once that is done, what you also want to then do is take relevant screenshots in that regard to show that your BitLocker environments have been incorporated accordingly in that regard. So that's the basics there when it comes to your particular assessment. I think that's the only questions or parts of the assessment that I got questions on, literally in terms of how to configure, how to set it up, and so on. But I think everything else is applicable because we've done that content, we've looked through it in detail, so you should be literally comfortable with configurations in that regard as far as your particular setup is concerned. So I think that literally is that. My main focus, like I mentioned before, was just on the actual storage spaces platform, which was the 20-mark question, which is 2.2, and then also looking at just the BitLocker part of your 2.6 question in that particular instance. I think this one also straightforward, but again, when it comes to your security, remember you're dealing with your security policy again in this regard. So what you want to then do, especially when you look at things like interactive logons and so on, what you want to take into consideration there, if you hit your Windows key plus R and you type out secpol.msc, which is your security policy, literally it's a Microsoft console platform. What you want to then concentrate on, especially when you look at your password policies and so on, you're dealing with your account policies at large. In that particular instance, we've got a password policy, account lockout policy, again, content that you should literally be familiar with. What you also want to look at is your local policies there and the different security options that are associated with your installation. Once you select that, this is where you want to work with your interactive logons as far as your setups would go. So this is where you'd obviously access content that is relevant as far as that particular question there is concerned. But ultimately, I think that literally covers that. I think I had initially mentioned that I'll re-record our session there to ensure that everyone is on point when it comes to this particular setup. But otherwise, I think that's pretty much that as far as your assessment at large when it comes to your environments there is concerned. All right, so I think that's that covers that, or that literally concludes the session. If you still have any questions or any particular sections that you might need revisited or anything that you might need elucidated, please pop me a mail and then we can take it from there as far as content is concerned. But otherwise, as usual, stay safe, keep smiling. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.